I mean, if I had all the answers, I wouldn't be a scholar of religion, right? I would be a normal, happy person, or I would be whatever I would be, but I certainly wouldn't be this. That's, I think, what an intellectual is, Hadi. It's somebody who sits with a question that is so profound and so puzzling that it does not have a clear answer, and you generate new thinking and new thought and new questions from that experience, that sitting. The mystery of God, as it were, is not nice. It's this power or this presence in the environment that is experienced in beautiful and wondrous, but also often terrifying and fearful ways. And that's what Otto was trying to get at, is that double sense of the sacred. You have fana, you have annihilation in these Sufi traditions, or you have emptiness or nothingness in the Buddhist traditions, or you have nada or nothing in the Spanish Catholic mystical tradition. You have the Ein Sof, or the nothing, the infinite in Jewish Kabbalah. You have these notions of infinity or emptiness or nothingness or annihilation pretty much everywhere. They share this impulse to take themselves apart and realize divinity or ultimate reality through this taking apart. I think if we take away our culture and our symbols and our beliefs and our assumptions, we do arrive at this shared human essence, or this non-essence, to be more. You talked about the respectable William James. You did not talk about the nitrous oxide or the mediums or the Society for Psychical Research. You didn't even know about those things. And so that's what I mean by weird. Let's call it consciousness. Is not produced by the brain, but it's filtered through or mediated by the brain. So when somebody has a near-death experience, or is in a car accident, or is engaged in a mystical practice that is shutting down the mind, that allows these other states of consciousness to flow in, but it doesn't actually produce those states of consciousness. Some forms of mystical or psychical experience are veridical, or they're empirical. It's the person is actually engaging with the real world on a level that's extraordinary, and he's horrified by the church because he realizes that the divinity he had just experienced in the natural world cannot be bound by whatever beliefs or rituals are going on in that little church. Was denying Christianity, but that he was denying that God can be limited to a particular religious institution or tradition. And I always would insist consciousness is not cognition, not the same thing at all. Thinking is not awareness. So I would say consciousness is not in space and time, but mind or cognition clearly are. So I write a lot about what I call the humanist two, that there are these two aspects of the human being, the physical, mental aspect, but also the consciousness is not restricted to the brain or the body.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. In this interview, we are interviewing Dr. Jeffrey Kripal from the United States, from the state of Texas. Jeffrey is the Associate Dean of the School of Humanities and holds the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University, where he chaired the Department of Religion for 8 years and helped create the GEM program, a doctoral concentration in the study of Gnosticism and mysticism, that is the largest program of its kind in the world. Jeff is the author of 11 books, including Secret Body, Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the history of religions and authors of the impossible, the paranormal, and the sacred. And he is presently working on a 3-volume study of paranormal currents in the history of religions and sciences. So welcome, Doctor, and it's an honor having you with us today.
Thank you, Hadi. It's a pleasure being here.
Okay, in the beginning, before I start asking my questions, tell us more about your personal journey in academic studies, especially in the subject of religion, spirituality, and your special interest in the superpowers and the supernatural in the modern world. And also, if you'd like to share any certain religious or spiritual experience that you've gone through, or people or incidences that affected your life or shaped your life, or anything that you'd like to share from your very long experience in teaching religion and spirituality.
Sure. No, I'll try to keep this fairly short. So I actually grew up in what we call the Midwest in the US. I grew up in the state of Nebraska, and I grew up among German farmers and small business owners. And I grew up Roman Catholic. I was very pious, and in my youth, I wanted to be a monk. So I started out my career going to college at a Benedictine seminary, which is essentially a place where young men went to study for the priesthood, the Roman Catholic priesthood. I was studying for the monastery, or I wanted to join a monastery. That's where I was introduced actually to the study of religion, and kind of got turned on or lit. The fire got lit there in the seminary by the monks who taught me about comparative religion and how to compare. And this was the 1980s. Roman Catholicism was opening up to the broader world, and it was very open to other religions, including Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. And so I was studying all those traditions, particularly Islam, by the way, in the seminary, particularly Sufism, through a scholar named Anne-Marie Schimmel, who was at Harvard early on at that point. I then went on to the University of Chicago, and I studied something called the history of religions, which basically is the comparative study of religion. And I graduated from there in 93, and I taught for 9 years at a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. And then I moved to Rice University in Houston, Texas in 2002, and I've been teaching here ever since. My early interests were in Christian and Hindu mysticism. And I wrote a lot about Christian mystical literature and Hindu mystical literature. In about 2000 or so, I started to turn to what we might call contemporary spiritual movements in the US, particularly in California. And I wrote a book on the California counterculture in a place called the Esalen Institute in 2007. That's what really got me interested in what I call the super, or these transcendent or anomalous or paranormal aspects of the human religious experience, because I met lots of people doing this work, and I heard their stories, and I realized that what they were telling me did not fit into any of my intellectual training. It couldn't happen. It was impossible. But I also realized they were telling me the truth, and that in fact, these things do happen and they're quite possible. And so I became really interested in that disjunction, or that abyss, or that gap between the academic world and actual human experience. And so I really have been working ever since, from about 2005, so maybe for 15, 16 years, to try to make intellectuals more comfortable talking about transcendent or anomalous religious experiences, really in any context, Hadi. And I think that's maybe what makes the work a little unique, is I'm not focused on any particular religious tradition. I'm actually most interested in modern people who have experiences that don't fit in to either their religious traditions or any other religious tradition. They're literally anomalous. They just sort of sit there. And I'm really interested in how people deal with that and what that tells us about the religious past, how we can better understand our own religious past by looking at the experiences of our friends and colleagues and people who write us. And so that's kind of where I find myself today is teaching young people how to compare religions, but also talking to people who have had these experiences and trying to figure out what they might mean in a broader context.
Mm-hmm.
And you asked about my own personal. Everybody asks me that actually. They want to know if I've had any of these extraordinary experiences, and my first instinct is to resist that question with humor, and to sort of deflect it. But the truth is I've had a few of these. I must say there are only a few of them. I had one overwhelming out-of-body experience when I was living in what was then Calcutta. Today it's Kolkata in India. And I've had a couple precognitive dreams. So I've had kind of minor little flashes of these experiences that I would say make me sympathetic and open me up to considering these things intellectually, but by no means render me in any sense spiritually advanced or a model for anyone else. So I'm not a spiritual teacher in any sense, but like many millions and millions of other human beings, yes, I've had these sorts of experiences.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk later more in depth in analyzing mystical or spiritual experiences. So maybe you'd like to describe such an experience or one of them that you felt. So what's the reality of such an experience when you encountered?
Yeah, I mean, well, the one that I always talk about, because I always get that question, is I was living in Calcutta in 1989, and I was participating in a Hindu festival called Kali Puja, and I was visiting all of these shrines in the city and viewing all of these, they're called murtis or images. And during one of the nights of this long festival, I woke up, but my body did not wake up. It was kind of a classic sleep paralysis experience. And this conscious, intelligent energy came out of me or came into me. I don't really know which. And it started to do things to me physically. And then it eventually imploded into my heart region. And I had the sensation of floating out of my body. And that I eventually came back into my body, obviously, and got control again. But I felt very much like it was a kind of initiation or a kind of transmission event. I didn't know what was being transmitted into me. I mean, it was very confusing as well. But it was very powerful, and it was not just a dream. I mean, I personally thought I was dying. It had an electrical or electromagnetic sensation to it. I thought there was some kind of malfunction in the wall and I was being electrocuted. I mean, that's how. It wasn't subtle. What I'm trying to tell you, it was not subtle. It was not a dream. It was just something symbolic or spiritual. It was deeply, deeply physiological and somehow electromagnetic as well. So that's really the most dramatic one I've had. And then I've had all these smaller ones. And of course, when I was in the seminary, I was engaged in spiritual direction and prayer and ritual and all kinds of religious practices that were, really overwhelming. I mean, certainly not 24 hours a day because I had to sleep, but certainly every hour I was awake, there was a religious thought or a religious practice.
Interesting. And the experience that you just mentioned, so maybe it was years or decades ago. So you can remember and recall it very clearly now.
Well, sure, I can recall it because I have to. Everybody asks about it, but I've also written about it. I've written about it probably too much, but I've written about it since 2001 in a book called Roads of Excess, Palaces of Wisdom, which was about the mystical experiences of scholars of mysticism. And the argument of the book was that European and American scholars of mysticism are not just walking brains, they're people, and they have had these mystical experiences, and they use those experiences to think and to do their scholarship. They're essentially closeted mystics who often don't have a tradition. And so I use myself in the book as an example. There was a kind of autobiographical thread through the book, and I wrote about that experience at length there. So that was 20 years ago, Hadi. So yeah, that's why I remember it.
So Jeff, when a person encounters such an experience, does he feel a very great will to try to search about the sacred or the spiritual or the Sufi dimensions in life and enhance them day by day, especially when he encounters such an experience, not only reading or writing about it?
It depends on the person and the culture, Hadi. I mean, I've encountered since then dozens, if not hundreds, of similar experiences in other people. And if the person is living in a secular culture without a religious tradition and without any categories or stories to make sense of the experience, the person will often just forget it and put it aside, and it may not have any effect. If the person's living in a religious system that has symbols or categories that can make sense of the experience, they will often use those and try to cultivate it again or develop it. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it sits at odds, doesn't really fit into the culture or the religion the person happens to inhabit. And then I think the experience is mostly one of confusion. And that can, if the person is intellectually inclined, they will sit with that confusion, sometimes for decades, because it's productive. But if they're not intellectually inclined, they'll just say, I don't know. And, and they'll go on with their lives. And they actually might be way happier than the intellectuals. I'm not really sure. So I think it just depends.
You're talking about yourself when you say intellectuals who feel wonder.
Yeah. I mean, I was obsessed with the experience, obviously. And, I've been obsessed with religion my whole life. So I do sit with it, and I sit with these questions and maybe these questions that can't be answered. That's I think what an intellectual is, Hadi. It's somebody who sits with a question that is so profound and so puzzling that it does not have a clear answer, and you generate new thinking and new thought and new questions from that experience, that sitting. I mean, if I had all the answers, I wouldn't be a scholar of religion, right? I would be a normal, happy person, or I would be whatever I would be, but I certainly wouldn't be this.
You reminded me with another professor which I was interviewing, and he told me that after an experience of 40 or 50 years in studying religion, the summary is that religion is all about wonder, perplexity. This is the major state or the major idea that wonder, and he talked about wonder and what does it mean and why it's wonder. So,
who were you talking to?
I think Dr. Robert Fuller.
Yeah, it sounds like Bob Fuller. Yeah, it sounds a lot like him. Yeah, he wrote a whole book on wonder, by the way. Yeah. Okay.
So what can we say about wonder? So a whole book, and do you agree?
Well, yeah. I mean, yes and no. I mean, I've read that book, and I know Bob, and what he's trying to argue there, which I agree with, is that human beings often encounter something that they call sacred, and it's an experience of wonder, by which he means it's an experience of fascination and beauty and mystery, and that mystery and that fascination pull you forward into a lifestyle or into a set of choices that sometimes are religious and sometimes are not. Certainly in the US, sometimes they're not, but traditionally they have been religious. So, and it also Bob is also coming out of the European study of religion. There's a author named Rudolf Otto who wrote a very important book called The Idea of the Holy. And basically what Otto argued is that the sacred is a mysterium fascinans, a mystery that's fascinating, but it's also terrifying. Awe and the awful are two sides of the same coin. The mystery of God, as it were, is not nice. It's this power or this presence in the environment that is experienced in beautiful and wondrous, but also often terrifying and fearful ways. And that's what Otto was trying to get at, is that double sense of the sacred. And what I think Bob Fuller's doing in his work on wonder is looking at the wonderful or the wondrous side of the sacred, which I think is totally apt.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Because also I was referring and comparing to the Sufi tradition, and I'm not sure about different Sufi traditions, but especially in the Islamic tradition, they insist on the notion of Hira. Hira is wonder, and they say when you encounter all the graces of God and you can't count them, and you feel blessings all around you, and you see the signs of God all over the places, and every day you encounter a different sign, or you encounter different names and qualities of God that are spread all over the world, then you start entering the state of wonder.
Yeah, no, there you go again. So I think what Bob was looking at in the book is people who are not in a religious tradition, and so who experience wonder in ways that are not necessarily theistic. But it certainly applies to theistic traditions as well.
Mm-hmm. So, Doctor, you mentioned in the beginning that you were blessed by meeting very open-minded monks at the beginning of your life, and then you chose the academic path, not the path of the church. And
that's correct. That's exactly what happened. I mean, the monks were wonderful, and they essentially taught me, though, that I had questions that could not really be answered in the context of Roman Catholicism, and that if I were going to pursue those questions, it would be better to do it outside the religious life, in some kind of more secular pursuit, or some kind of more scholarly pursuit. And so that was a big reason why I left, was particularly my interest in other religions was not going to be fulfilled the way I wanted it to be within the Catholic tradition, even though it was a very generous and very open-ended tradition at that point. It had not been earlier. It had been very closed, by the way, to other religions. But in the 1960s, in a series of meetings, usually referred to as Vatican II, it had opened up in a very ecumenical way to these other religions. So I sort of came into the flow, or came into the stream, about 15 years after Vatican II. And so it was still in this opening up kind of mode. Mm-hmm. It closed a little after that, and now perhaps it's opening up a bit. So it kind of goes through these waves.
So you're satisfied with your decision at that time? You didn't feel that kind of combining between the two experiences is better? The intellectual, academic, and the church and monk experience?
Yeah, I mean, that was what I had, Hadi. I mean, I was just a kid, I was a 18-year-old kid from the farmland of Nebraska. I mean, what did I know, right? And here were these, very cosmopolitan, highly educated monks who had PhDs from really all over the world. And so they were opening me up to other aspects of the world that I knew nothing about as a kid or as a child. And so I wanted to pursue those questions.
Great. And you mentioned that you met or you studied with Amri Shamel. She's a very famous scholar in Sufism. So you recall?
No, I didn't study with her. I was reading her in the seminary, but no, I never met Professor Schimmel.
Okay, and you also mentioned about meeting many different people who had experiences, and then you try to explain those. So, what kind you mean, like mystical experiences, NDEs, or and they are very spread that a person can see many of.
I mean, it was the whole spectrum. I mean, I talked to people who had out-of-body experiences in childbirth while giving birth to a child. I talked to people who had clearly had precognitive dreams, who knew what was going to happen before it happened. I talked to people who had seen balls of light that appeared to be conscious or intelligent, UFO experiences, we'd call them today. I talked to people who had various kinds of psychedelic openings that had on LSD or psilocybin or some kind of psychoactive plant or molecule, who had experienced God essentially in these events. I mean, the whole gamut. I mean, you name it, I heard stories about it, and not just stories, but deeply personal experiences that fundamentally changed the lives of these individuals. So these were not just stories. These were essentially conversion experiences that they were telling me about. And I was very moved by it because of the people. I heard a story, I've often told this story. I had a woman once who drove hundreds of miles out of her way to tell me about her dead daughter who had tried to contact them through a cell phone. They essentially gotten a phone call from a dead daughter. And many people had, by the way. There was no voice on the end, but the number was from her. So just that experience makes no sense, Hadi. I mean, there's really no way to understand that. But this woman just desperately wanted someone to listen to her, and I think wanted someone to say, I believe you. I believe it happened. And of course, I did believe it happened. So that's what I said to her, and it's all she wanted to hear. And when you write about these things in public, which is what I do, people write you and they tell you their stories and they open their hearts to you. And sometimes, they're always complete strangers, but they feel like they know you because you just laid your heart on the page. And so they're responding with, a long letter, or we used to get letters. Now we get emails, but it's the same thing.
Very interesting, actually. And you mentioned India, so you went there to study religion, or you were there for a visit only?
Oh, where was that?
When you were mentioning your spiritual experience, you said that you were visiting shrines in the Hindu tradition in India.
Yeah, I was in Calcutta. I was living in northeastern India for a year. I had studied Bengali I studied Bengali for 8 years and studied Sanskrit for about 2.5. So I was living in India and I was studying Hinduism alongside medieval Christian mysticism. That's what I was doing.
Okay, doctor. So now we'll go to our questions that we've prepared for this interview after knowing too much about your life and experiences. What's your perspective on the unity of being theory, which is the core idea in Sufi school of thought, and maybe it has different expressions in many spiritual traditions. So mystics of different religions may agree in a way or another with the essence of this theory. So do you have a certain idea about it?
Yeah, I mean, so at least in the Western Academy, unity is a bad word. And I don't mean in the mystical sense or the Sufi sense. I mean, generally, any kind of sameness or any kind of unity is seen as a way to take over something. It's a power grab, essentially. And so what is emphasized in the present day kind of postmodern academy is difference. So there's this constant focus on difference and multiplicity, and sameness and unity are always looked on with suspicious eyes. I am quite critical of that, Hadi. I think that this human species is obviously a single species. The planet is obviously one planet, not 4 or 5 or 100, and that we share a lot. We share far more than we don't share, hence this conversation that's going on right now. And with mystical traditions in particular, they often key into these similarities or even these identities, this unity of God, as the Sufi tradition sometimes puts it. And I happen to think that's a reality as well, and that we simply have not faced up to that, at least in the Western Academy. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the people I deal with every day. They're very good at difference. They're very poor at unity or sameness. And so this is what draws me, I think, to a lot of mystical writers, is their attempt to really balance how human beings are different, but also how we share something that is the same.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you mentioned in your interesting article, Reimagining the Super in Study of Religions, for new Platonists, the natural world is entirely embedded and rooted in the supernatural, of which it is the manifestation. The supernatural is super here, then not in the sense of against nature or outside of nature, but in the sense of expressive of the most hidden and deepest structures of the cosmos, which is itself an emanation or expression of the one. I would like to comment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, the reason Western intellectuals reject the supernatural is because, for historical reasons, they think that it refers to something outside nature. It's above nature. And so the agency of the supernatural, or the reality of the supernatural, has to be completely outside the natural order. And what I'm trying to point out there is, well, that's certainly part of Western Christian theology, is this notion of creation as ex nihilo, as out of nothing, and that God exists outside the natural order. That's certainly the case in a lot of Christian theology. But you also have these Neoplatonic strands of thinking in which the one does not create the world out of nothing. It emanates the world out of itself. And so in these models, the physical world is literally God, or it's literally the one that is emanated like the rays coming out of a sun into and as the world. And so there you have a model that's not supernatural in the traditional sense, but is supernatural, two words. It's entirely natural, but it recognizes, or it asserts, that the source of the natural world is this divine source. And that's a very different model than people are used to. But I think it's that Neoplatonic vision that results in a lot of Christian, Jewish, and Sufi mystical traditions. I think that's sort of the grammar that those three traditions share, actually.
And it has, do you believe it has an ethical dimension or a practical dimension in the life of a human being? Like if he believed in such a theory, it will reflect on his attitude, his...
Well, that's a tough question. I'm a historian, and so my first responsibility is to be faithful to the actual history of religions and not just to what we want those histories to be. And I'm not convinced that there is a direct connection between the moral and the metaphysical. In other words, somebody can have an experience of the one and still be a pretty awful human being, right? What the religious traditions try to do, of course, is make a connection. They try to argue that if you experience the one, you will emphasize virtue and unity and compassion and love and all of these things. And that, of course, is sometimes the case because that's what the traditions are cultivating. But sometimes it's not the case, and so I have to be honest about both of those situations. And so, basically what I say is there's no necessary connection, but of course a connection is often made. And there might ultimately be a connection, Hadi. I don't speak for God or the one. I don't know. And I know what the traditions argue is that there is in fact a deep connection, and that these human failings that I'm referring to are simply human failings. They're not a reflection on the one or on God, as it were. I understand that. I'm just trying to make sense of what I see in history.
So it differs between different people, obviously.
Yeah.
Doctor, we'll go more now into comparative religion studies. Some theories state that religions are very far apart in law system, rituals or jurisprudence, and they come a bit closer to each other in theological doctrines, and more closer to each other in ethical and moral theories, and then in spiritual experiences, and then more and more in sacred or revelation experience, which is the highest form of religious experience. There where the core or essence of religion is found, the more we go up, from rituals until we reach to the high forms of spiritual experiences. So the more we reach to unity, and I think the traditional or the perennial school of wisdom, they also believe in a kind of transcendent unity of religions. Or then other people would say that commonalities and similarities to a certain extent can be found in all religions. For example, all religions focus on being ethical, moral in life, seeking virtues, meditation in different forms, and self-actualization or feeling a connection with a higher power. So such similarities also can be found in all religions. So what's your idea about a unity or the similarities that we can find?
Yeah. So I describe myself as an accidental perennialist. And I'll explain that in a minute. I'm actually not a perennialist in the sense that Houston Smith or Syed Hussein Nasser talk about perennialism. In their view, perennialism is essentially this idea that the religions all intend the same ultimate truth or unity. That if you get high enough in these different traditions, they're different paths up the same mountain. They're going to reach the same peak, and that's this unity of the religions. I don't believe that, actually. I think the religions are different mountains, and that people are walking up different mountains and creating different heights through their rituals and their systems and their beliefs. However, I believe on each of those mountains, individuals often awaken into the sky, into the empty, luminous sky that embeds all of these mountains, and that they share that and they talk about that and they recognize that experience of the sky on other mountains and other religions. So, but I think that happens accidentally. In other words, I think that happens to individual people within different religious traditions, and then they have to work very hard to make their religions fit that experience of the sky. But it's not easy. And it's not what the religions intend. It's not what the mountains want. The mountains want you to keep going up the mountain, but it's a different mountain. So I don't know if that helps. So I want to affirm that human beings have similar or the same mystical awakenings in different traditions, but I don't want to say that the traditions intend or are about the same thing, because I just don't think they are. I think we have to recognize our differences, but also recognize what happens when people have similar experiences.
Maybe the religious institutions more concentrate on staying on your particular mountain, but the essence of every religion will tell you that open yourself to the sky.
Well, okay, so you're a perennialist, it sounds like. So that's okay, but so I don't think the religions, I don't think that's the essence of the religions. I think that just happens to some people. That's why I call myself an accidental perennialist. I think it just happens, and we don't understand why it happens. But I don't think that the essence of the religions are the same. I really, truly do not believe that.
So you mean that it's a grace that is given for a person, like a gift. It's not something that a person.
Yeah, I think very often the person will tell you, I didn't do anything, or I don't deserve this. This was in Christian terms, this was pure grace. Or in my terms, it was completely accidental. I really, it's not me. It's not, trust me, it's not me. Now, for some people though, for some human beings, I think they are gifted, and I think they are capable of cultivating these states, but I think that's very rare. And I think most of us are more like me, we're dull, we're not so gifted. And so it doesn't matter how long we practice or pray or do whatever, it's not going to happen. And I don't think we understand that. And I know the religions have explanations, but I just don't believe the explanations. I just don't believe them. I think they're sort of ways to fix the system, but they're not truly accurate to the human condition and the human experience.
So, Dr. Jeffrey, you reminded me of a terminology that you used in one of your articles, which is emptiness. I don't know if it's related to our discussion now. You mentioned that emptiness is also a classical mystical trope, and as such can also be a sign of some of the further reaches of religious experience. You refer to emptiness when talking about the example of a secular hospital which doesn't contain any particular religious sign or symbol.
Yeah, I mean, so you have, and you correct my Arabic here, you have fana, you have annihilation in the Sufi traditions, or you have emptiness or nothingness in the Buddhist traditions, or you have nada or nothing in the Spanish Catholic mystical tradition. You have the Ein Sof, or the nothing, the infinite in Jewish Kabbalah. You have these notions of infinity or emptiness or nothingness or annihilation pretty much everywhere. And so that to me is a much better place to go to look for commonality when the traditions are taking themselves apart, essentially. I think they share that. They share this impulse to take themselves apart and realize divinity or ultimate reality through this taking apart. So that to me is that's why I talk about the sky as empty or luminous. It's not the mountain. The sky is not the mountain, but the mountain is in the sky, as it were.
There is also this idea which says that get rid from all the kinds of knowledge which you gain by relying on your brain and on your intellectual abilities, and open yourself to a higher state of being or a higher state of knowledge, or you'll be open to a different source, which is the very real source, or a source that is very deep inside yourself, and or a certain instinct, a fitra, we say, experience that is there inside every human being.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think if we take away our culture and our symbols and our beliefs and our assumptions, we do arrive at this shared this shared human essence, or this non-essence, to be more faithful to it, I think. But again, I mean, this is what we call apophatic mystical theology in the Christian tradition. And I know there are aspects, there are very developed traditions within the Sufi traditions as well. And I think I think this is where to go to find conversations across traditions. I don't think there's always a good way to talk across traditions when we're talking about positive beliefs or statements. I think there is a place to talk across traditions when we're talking about apophatic techniques, what we can say away, what we can leave behind.
Doctor, you mentioned Sayyid Hussein Nasr and all this growing field of Sufism, or Islamic traditional Sufism and mysticism, which is growing in the academia in the States and in Europe. So how do you analyze this? And so what are the reasons of this? It is the thirst for spirituality, and this is one form of spirituality that's growing, or?
So I'm not part of those academic currents. I don't study Islamic cultures, as I'm sure you know, but the study of mystical literature, or the study of what's sometimes called mysticism, is a very integral and very old part of the Western study of religion. It goes back about 150 years now. I mean, you can take it back as far as you want, but the category of mysticism really arises in the 18th and 19th centuries in the West. And it enters the comparative study of religion in a big way in the 20th century. And a figure like Sayyid Hussein Nasr is a very, very important figure in that modern history. And that's certainly a current of the study of religion I participate in, the study of mysticism, but not in the sense that Nasr does it, because I'm trying to study people who are having mystical experiences but don't have a religion. That's what I'm most interested in looking at. Or I'm interested in how the sciences now are providing metaphors and languages for people to have these mystical experiences with. That to me is really interesting. But that's not what the study of mysticism has been. It's tended to be focused on Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism or whatever tradition you want to talk about.
Also, in talking about comparative studies, or between the mystical dimension that combines, or which is similar in all different traditions and religions, we can encounter now many studies in the academia. For example, I was reading a study by Leonore de Leosin, who was comparing between the English Romantic and Persian Sufi poets, for example, or another person who wrote a book titled Paths to Transcendence, according to Shankara, Eckhart, and Ibn Arabi. So, for example, such researches are being done now.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, Meister Eckhart and Ibn al-Arabi they're favorites. I mean, we love those guys in the study of religion, because they're essentially they're contemporaries, actually, roughly. And they're both medieval thinkers who were extremely sophisticated and who said and wrote a lot of things that even today ring true to a lot of us. So, yes, I mean, Rudolf Otto, to go back to Otto wrote a whole book comparing Meister Eckhart and the Hindu philosopher Shankara. So I mean, this use of Eckhart to, talk across traditions is quite old, and so is Ibn al-Arabi, of course. William Chittick wrote a whole book called Imaginal Worlds, basically using Ibn al-Arabi to think about religious pluralism. So absolutely.
How do you analyze his effort in trying to build a theory of pluralism from the ideas of Ibn Arabi? He did a great job there, or?
Yeah, I personally like it. I mean, I think if we operated with a theology closer to Ibn al-Arabi or Meister Eckhart, we'd be in a much different world right now. And frankly, a much better world, because we would see all of our religions as essentially imaginal expressions of some deeper and more basic fundamental source or ground or God, to speak in more theistic terms. So yeah, one of the things I talk and teach a lot about is what I call the comparative methods of the religions. It's not just modern scholars who compare religions. That's ridiculous. Human beings have been comparing religions for millennia, and every religion that is old enough has developed a whole entire systems of comparison. And of course, these mystical writers have their own modes of comparison too. And I tend to be drawn to these mystical modes of comparison. I tend not to be drawn to the more institutional or orthodox forms, because they emphasize difference and they emphasize the superiority of one tradition over another, where the mystical modes of comparison tend to emphasize similarity and unity. They recognize difference, but they're trying to get at this deeper kind of undercurrent. And that's simply attractive, I think.
Doctor, in this context, what about William James and his very great book, Varieties of Religious Experience? It's still one of the great books.
Yeah, so William James is my hero. I mean, I have a couple, 2 or 3 heroes. One is William James. And the reason I love William James, well, there's a lot of reasons to love William James, but, James was doing what I'm trying to do. He was looking at ordinary people having crazy experiences. And by the way, he was doing things like inhaling nitrous oxide and chewing on mescaline. And I mean, he was taking psychedelics himself to try to have these experiences. And he was heavily involved in what was then called psychical research, essentially sitting with mediums and psychics and trying to understand how they contacted the dead or whether they contacted the dead and what that might mean. So James was just all over the place, and in a really productive way that he could then synthesize and integrate in those lectures that became the Varieties of Religious Experience, which is, 1901 or 2, I forget the date. It's easily one of 4 or 5 of the most important books ever written, at least in the West, on the comparative study of religion. No question. So if you want to call me a Jamesian, I will just smile. I mean, it's a great compliment. But James was a weird guy, and again, that's a compliment for me. It's not a criticism.
If you'd like to say more about James and why he was considered a bit weird guy, as you say.
Oh yeah, I mean, come on. I mean, so let's just give you an example. So when I was in graduate school, we all read the Varieties. I mean, you had to. It was just like bread and butter, right? And we talked endlessly about James and mysticism and pragmatism and all of this stuff that's relatively, relatively respectable. But nobody ever told us that James spent basically his whole life studying psychics and mediums, and that he himself founded the American Society for Psychical Research. Nobody ever told us that. There's this whole paranormal or supernormal aspect of William James that just gets lopped off. And then if you look closely at his life, you realize he was a big fan of this man named Benjamin Blood, who wrote this book called The Anesthetic Revelation, which basically made the argument that taking particular psychoactive drugs or substances can open up the human person to these other worlds. And so James himself took these substances. He literally was inhaling nitrous oxide at one point. To read Hegel, of all people, by the way. He actually claimed Hegel made sense if you were on nitrous oxide, but once you came down from the gas, Hegel no longer made sense. So, I mean, this is just wild. And this is going on in Harvard, really the guy who founded the American psychology in the last decade and first decade of the 20th century, last decade of the 19th, first decade of the 20th. So I just think James is just this wild man who, managed to pass as a respectable professor, but was really engaged in all of these mystical practices, psychical practices, and psychedelic practices on the side. And of course, that's my world. That was the California counterculture, by the way, that I was trying to understand, in the 70s. Well, the culture itself was in the 70s and 80s. I was writing about it 20 years ago, so I was not in it. But that's what I was trying to understand.
So you mean he's weird because he tried everything, including drugs, just to get these spiritual experiences?
Yeah, he was weird in the sense that his interests and his techniques were not those of the American Academy at that point. He was weird in the sense that all of that was lopped off or erased when we were reading him in the 1980s and 90s. You read the respectable William James. You talked about the respectable William James. You did not talk about the nitrous oxide or the mediums or the Society for Psychical Research. You didn't even know about those things. And so that's what I mean by weird. Again, I don't mean bad. I mean anomalous. I mean culturally anomalous. That's what.
And he wasn't spiritual in the sense of traditional Christian person.
Well, yes and no. His father, Henry James, was literally a spiritualist, capital S. He's a Swedenborgian, Emanuel Swedenborg. James himself referred to himself as having a mystical germ, by which he meant he had a deep desire for mystical experience, and he resonated deeply with the mystical experiences of other people, but he himself was not particularly gifted. So I think he was what we call a seeker. He was not located in a particular tradition, but he was deeply sympathetic and wanted a mystical experience for his own awakening or his own realization, but never quite got there.
That's why he was gathering all different kinds of experiences from the people that he encountered.
Yeah, there were no barriers. I mean, he would almost try almost anything. And if you read his last essays, Hadi, and I mean his last ones, right before he died, they're wild. I mean, he's getting into things like panpsychism and kind of a collective mind or a kind of super mind into which we all die and emerge back with. We emerge from this kind of oceanic mind of the cosmos as individuals, but when we die, we sink back into it and we become the universal mind again. And he's not saying these are true, but he's saying this is what I'm thinking now, and then he dies. He dies about 1910 or so. I don't remember the exact date.
Similar to the idea of the fana, reaching to the state of fana or nothing of the sort.
Yeah, I mean, you can do that. I mean, he didn't know a lot about Sufism, by the way. But you can read his thought, I think, in Sufi categories fairly effectively.
Mm-hmm. What do you believe one of his most important or major theories or thoughts that he presented in the whole book of the varieties?
Well, Yeah. So, I mean, I think his most important idea is what is sometimes called the filter thesis or the transmission thesis. And this is the idea that consciousness, or if we want to call it soul, let's call it consciousness, is not produced by the brain, but it's filtered through or mediated by the brain. So when somebody has a near-death experience or is in a car accident or is engaged in a mystical practice that is shutting down the mind, that allows these other states of consciousness to flow in, but it doesn't actually produce those states of consciousness. So and once you make that move, a lot of religious practice makes a lot of sense, by the way. And then you can also explain why something like the survival of bodily death might make sense, because consciousness is not produced by the brain. Of course the brain dies. Of course it shuts down. Duh. But it's like, it's like your cell phone. Your cell phone does not produce Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi produces your cell phone. And you just have to make that flip. And James had made that flip. And he wasn't arguing for that idea as true. He couldn't prove it, but he thought it explained a lot more of his religious data. And he makes that move in varieties. He makes it more explicitly later in other contexts, but you can see him making that move in varieties.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think this point you also mentioned in the conclusion of your article, reimagining in this the super in the study of religions, when you say to the end, more to my final point, what if the brain is not the producer, but the reducer of consciousness? Rather like a transformer or a telephone pole steps down, just like you mentioned now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's James. And there are other people in the Western world who have said that. The next one, who's also my big hero, who said it probably the most successfully, was Aldous Huxley, in a book called The Doors of Perception. But a lot of people are saying that in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. We're not necessarily heard, but we're trying to say it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Doctor, what about Robert Orsi and the theory of real presence? I think he has a very interesting theory that he's trying to talk about.
So Robert Orsi is a historian of Roman Catholicism, and he's trying to, he has this notion of abundant history, and he also has this notion of real presence. And what he means by that, I mean, you kind of have to be inside the academy to understand it, but basically inside the Western Academy, people want to talk about absence. They want to talk about the absence of God. There is no subject. There is no person. Everything is denied. And what Orsi's trying to say is, well, if you look at people's religious experiences, there are these radical forms of presence. People claim to experience the presence of God, or they have a vision of the Virgin Mary, or they experience a miraculous cure. The cancer's gone. Positive things happen. It's not just about absence. It's also about real divine presence. And, I mean, of course, within Roman Catholicism, the real presence is a reference to the Eucharist. It's kind of at the core of Catholic sacramental theology. And so Bob is very much talking about Catholic theology there as well. So it's a complicated argument, but he's basically just trying to bring something positive back into the study of religion where it's been expelled for about 30 or 40 years now.
So he means by presence, the presence of the sacred, of God, of the reality in our everyday life?
Not necessarily. Yeah, yes, in everyday life, but also in these extraordinary moments where someone has a vision or there's a cure or someone has a mystical experience. That for him is real presence and needs to be affirmed and not just wished away.
Because also one of my friends, he was studying Robert Orsi and the theory of presence, and he was comparing with the ideas, the Sufi ideas. For example, like wherever you go, there is the face of God or the manifestations of God names and qualities, and each name and quality manifests in certain areas. So, for example, when eating and drinking, certain names are there. When playing, certain names are there. When studying and working with knowledge and ideas, the certain different names are there, and all the names are different manifestations that manifest the presence of the absolute or the sacred.
Yeah, I think that's actually a fair comparison. I think that's, the Catholic notion of sacramentality is actually also related to the notion of incarnation, which I know is not an orthodox view in Islam, but it is in Catholicism. And the idea is that God is experienced in the physical world, in the bread and the wine, or in the water of baptism, or in the just ordinary experience in the physical world, that God manifests God through the material world. So that's kind of how it works in Catholicism. I know it works differently in an Islamic context, but I think the comparison's fair and accurate.
Doctor, one of your main ideas, I believe, is what you mentioned in an article when you call it realist impulse of the new super scholarship that is awakening, that is the awakening realization that certain types of religious experience, far from being nothing more than a psychological delusion or social expression, might actually grant access, point us to the real itself. What do you mean?
Well, so again, I'm arguing with my peers, with my colleagues, and they want to say that when someone has a mystical experience, that's just the brain doing funny stuff, right? It's just the brain. It's pure psychological projection. And I want to argue, no, some forms of mystical or psychical experience are veridical, or they're empirical. It's the person is actually engaging with the real world on a level that's extraordinary. And so someone says, so for example, someone can dream about a loved one dying weeks before the loved one is killed in an accident. That's not a psychological projection. That person has tapped into the very nature of space and time and has received information from 2 weeks out that is veridical. It's empirical. It's accurate. Or when someone experiences the unity of God or the unity of ultimate reality, I want to argue, no, that's empirical. Reality really is unitary. And when they have that mystical experience, they're actually experiencing the real. They're not just having a projection in their head. So that's what I mean by the realist impulse. But it's very much goes against what most people are doing in the academy these days. But it's of course it's very faithful to, it's very similar to, I think, what the claims of a lot of these traditions would be.
Dr. Jeffrey, I'll go to another topic, which is sacred art. You have a whole article about that photo, and I'll keep the photo in our background so the viewers can see it. So art and sacredness. In the article, you explain things about a photo of Madonna and child with the infant saint. So if you would like to summarize what you meant in this article and the whole article about the relation between sacredness and art.
Is this the article called La Madonna del UFO? Yeah. So so the argument there is essentially that artists are pretty extraordinary, and they will often record things that don't sit very well within their own culture or their own time. And if you look at that painting, it's ostensibly of the Virgin Mary with her child, but in the background is this farmer or this peasant and his dog, by the way, looking up at this object in the sky that looks pretty much exactly like a UFO. And the problem is the date. I don't have the date here, Hadi, but it's sometime in the 16th century, I believe. The painting just looks like it just doesn't belong. It's just like completely out of space and out of time. And essentially what I'm trying to argue in the article is you really can't read a painting like that in traditional Orthodox theological terms. You have to recognize that it's expressing probably what's an actual experience of someone seeing something in the sky. And that, yeah, these things we call UFOs today have been around a long time. And, people have been seeing them, and they've even been putting them in their paintings. And that's okay. We don't have to read that away as a symbol or as a metaphor for something else. It might be what it is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you say that, so is it only art? Is it only power and politics? Is it only our scholarly imagination? Or know that there is something paranormal, magical, spiritual, mystical, or out of space and time? So between these.
Yeah, I mean, the way that painting is normally read in an art historical context is the art historian would try to make the claim that the thing in the sky is somehow a symbol of the Holy Spirit or something. And my point is that's kind of crazy, really. That's a stretch. Why go there? Why not just let it sit and just say, it looks to me like an experience that the painters put in there. An experience, by the way, that even, again, the dog is having. This is what I love about the painting. It can't be a human projection. The freaking dog is watching it along with the peasant. So I just am baffled by people's inability to accept things.
So you mean experience have levels according to different creatures. So let every person feel the experience that he will feel.
That people can have experiences that have nothing to do with their space and time. But of course, they'll express them in the metaphors and symbols of that space and time. So here you have a very Renaissance painting of the Virgin and Child, right? Or a Virgin and a child. But you also have this thing in the sky that looks pretty much like people report in 2021, here in the US or in France or in Latin America or wherever you want to go. So can't we recognize the similarity across centuries and across cultures? Why do we always have to reduce things to some particular context?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And
that's
here,
my argument.
Yeah, I'll ask you also about the idea that you mentioned in another article, which is religion of no religion. What do you mean by that? You mentioned that Frederick, I don't know his name, Spiegelberg.
His name is Frederick Spiegelberg.
Yeah, Spiegelberg, and the profound mystical experience that he had, known as a young man, where he had a sacred feeling, viewing everything around him as holy, and suddenly he sees a church, and then the church, it corrupted his experience. I don't recall exactly.
Yeah, so Spiegelberg was the scholar of comparative religion at Stanford in the 1950s who taught the two founders of the Esalen Institute, Michael Murphy and Richard Price. And he wrote a book in 49 or 50 called The Religion of No Religion, by which he did not mean secularism or atheism. He meant this mystical experience that is beyond all the religions, but that gives rise to all the religions. And so he talks about his own mystical experience in a wheat field, in which he experiences God in a kind of Neoplatonic sense as sort of the source of all of this emanation. And then he continues walking, and he runs into a little gray church with a cross on top of it, and he's horrified by the church, because he realizes that the divinity he had just experienced in the natural world cannot be bound by whatever beliefs or rituals are going on in that little church. So it wasn't that he was denying Christianity, but that he was denying that God can be limited to a particular religious institution or tradition. And that's what he meant by the religion of no religion. It's a paradoxical kind of mystical statement, really, that affirms all religions by seeing them as coming from the same source.
Another philosopher would call it the religion in the religions, for example, or the instinct of religions.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could. I mean, that's not Spiegelberg. That's more Houston Smith. But yeah, you could do that.
So, Doctor, we are going from an article to another article of yours, and we are mentioning some summaries of the ideas there. So another interesting article is Comparison Gets You Nowhere, the comparative study of religion and the spiritual, but not religious. So if you'd like to mention a summary about that effort.
Yeah, I mean, so comparison, again, is something that is problematic in my professional world. People don't like to compare. They like to just talk about a specific culture or a specific figure. They don't want to compare across cultures or much less across times. And one of the ways comparison is resisted in a religious context is religious people will say, well, comparison goes nowhere. It doesn't affirm my religious position. It actually ends up denying it. And so I talk about this problem and how there's something to it. You know, I want to honor that criticism. And I talk about a modern chapel in a Western hospital that if you've been in one, you may not have, there's nothing in them. They're empty, you know, because you actually can't put a religious symbol up. Because once you put a religious symbol up, you've privileged that religion over every other religion. So you land in this empty comparative space where you're trying to affirm everybody's religion, but by doing that, you're affirming none of them. And I just want to honor that. And I want to say that makes sense. And that's kind of where we're at today, at least in the West. We're trying to honor everyone's religious traditions, but to do that, you can honor none of them fully. And that's the paradox of the comparative thought, as it were. And so that's what that essay struggles with. Mm-hmm. It doesn't give an answer, Hadi. It just says, yeah, that's a problem.
You also say that there is something beyond knowing, and this is a book title, and things which we can't keep on our academic table. Where the human imagination play an important role in these visions. And then you say if we keep those extreme narratives and impossible stories on the middle of our academic table, then we can really start thinking about the nature of consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I think, that these extraordinary experiences are the key. And taking them seriously doesn't mean believing them all literally, because you can't, because they contradict one another. But if you understand them symbolically, you can take them all seriously and begin to create a comparative model of what consciousness is.
So you believe, Doctor, that the mind can know things that are not limited to space and time, because the mind itself is not limited to space and time, and it can predict things that are unpredicted or that.
Yeah. I mean, yes, that's essentially what I believe. Now, we have to be careful with our words. And of course, everybody uses the word mind differently. I would tend to refer to consciousness as not restricted to space and time. Mind with a lowercase m is probably a function of brain. And I always would insist consciousness is not cognition, not the same thing at all. Thinking is not awareness. So I would say consciousness is not in space and time, but mind or cognition clearly are. You know, so I write a lot about what I call the humanist two, that there are these two aspects of the human being, the physical, mental aspect, but also the consciousness is not restricted to the brain or the body.
So we can say, doctor, that what we see in the nerve system, or all the people who are studying now the nerve system, and they have these new tools that can affect the nerve system in order to let you feel a certain feeling. So we can say that consciousness and thinking and even spiritual experiences and very high mystical experiences are something beyond space and time and the nerve system. However, it manifests in the nerve system in these changes that we can see.
Correct. So what those neuroscientists are doing is they're studying the cell phone. They're taking the cell phone or the smartphone apart, but they're not studying the Wi-Fi. They're studying how they're studying the receiver and how it's put together. They're not studying what's being received.
Doctor, in this context, how can we understand the idea of a miracle? Some definitions say that it's a message, proof of God's power and presence. So the miracle, how we can understand this idea?
If something's, I mean, obviously people mean different things by something being a miracle. But essentially what I'm trying to do is say, when something miraculous happens, it isn't necessarily located in the body and brain. It might be coming from this Wi-Fi signal, as it were, and that everything's connected. Everything's connected to everything else. We're ultimately all one thing. And so, quote unquote, miraculous things can happen all the time, but they're not really outside of reality. They're very much an expression of reality. It's just that reality isn't what we think it is. So, the miracle in religious context is usually seen as coming from outside the natural order. I'm not so sure. I mean, sometimes it might be. Sometimes I'm not so sure. I think we have to be careful with that category. Historically in the Christian West, the miracle was a sign. It was meant to communicate a meaning or a message. It wasn't a violation of nature. It was an expression. God was expressing himself through the natural world. So I think it depends on how you read that.
Doctor, one of the ideas that you mentioned in your article is that academics and through engaging in the field of comparative religion studies bear a real responsibility for the production or appearance of SBNR, spiritual but not religious, as a modern phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, I think the study of religion is partly responsible for it, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, I think a lot of things that appear in American society or European society began actually in the universities. And I think the SBNR is a good example that, academics have been talking like this for 40, 50 years, if not longer. The spiritual but not religious as a movement in the US is much younger. Probably began, by the way, with Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, which that literally talked about being spiritual but not religious in the 1960s. So it probably goes back 50 years. But today, basically what we're seeing in the US is young people are not affiliating with a religious tradition. Largely for moral reasons, by the way. They see their churches or their religious traditions as too judgmental, particularly around issues of gender and sexuality. And so they are refusing to identify with their own birth traditions. And they're saying, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, by which they mean they affirm some spiritual nature or purpose to human life, but they don't believe what their parents or their grandparents believe.
So say they feel some negative sides in the established religion or the institution, and they choose to be spiritual but not religious to be away from these, or they have questions that are not answered in the church, for example.
These are my students you're talking about. I mean, I know these people. I mean, these are the students I work with every day. I really think this decision is primarily a moral or ethical one. I think they're just horrified, actually. by their traditions, most of which are some form of Christianity, by the way, and they're just appalled by the hatred and the bigotry of their own religious traditions. And they're just basically, they say to themselves, I don't want anything to do with it. I'm not going to even try. I'm going to walk away. And so they walk away. And that's not a perfect solution, Hadi. I'm not suggesting that, because what they leave behind is community and tradition and history and culture and all kinds of really good things. And I don't know where that's going yet. We don't really know where that's going. But what we do know as historians is that religions never stay the same, and that new religious movements are born out of old religious movements. We know that. That's just the history of religions. So my best guess is that the spiritual but not religious are kind of an early sign that something else is taking shape that we can't see yet.
And your religion will take place in a certain shape in the future.
In the future, yeah, that we cannot see. And maybe that religion will look nothing like historical religions. People will affiliate differently, they'll form community differently, they'll perform ritual differently. We just don't know, because we can't see that far ahead.
Maybe it's related to all the aspects of the secular age that we are living in, or the world is becoming a very small village. So they invent a religion that is will be applicable for such an era.
Maybe. I mean, certainly, yeah. Certainly, secularism, at least in the U.S. context, does not mean no religion. It means hundreds of religions. I mean, there's this like explosion of religion. It's just that there are hundreds or thousands of them now. There's not one or two.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, several times you mentioned your students, and you say that comparative methods change the life of people. Or, for example, you say it was my experience over a decade of teaching thousands of students at that point that comparison done well leaves the typical student in a kind of existential crisis in that aforementioned nowhere, in which every culture is enacting its own world, but in which no such single world can function as a stable, permanent, or absolute place. So if you can talk about some of the experiences of your students.
Yeah, so I care about what happens to my students. And when you give people comparative forms of thinking, they're extremely powerful, and they will relativize or make less convincing whatever the culture is that the student's coming from. But they will also open that young person up to other human beings and other cultures, and they will make that human being more tolerant and more open-minded and open-hearted. And I think those two things go together. And so a lot of teaching is just dealing with that anxiety that comes from being opened up and realizing that I was raised in one culture, in one religion, in this little tiny corner of the world, and the world's big and it's round, and there are all kinds of other people and all kinds of other beliefs. That's very, that can be very terrifying, by the way, but it can also be very liberating. And I think what a good teacher does is it takes that fear and turns it into a kind of joy or a kind of compassion. And you never give the student answers, because you yourself don't have answers, but you help people sit with that fear and maybe see a little more joy in it than terror. So that's really what I mean there.
You also say that comparison was not some abstract cognitive exercise. It was prison, it was mysticism, it was exile, and it was justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think to really compare one another fairly leads to social justice. It leads to a mystical awareness that we're all the same, or we're all one. I mean, but that's at the far edges of comparison. I mean, obviously, that's not what happens generally in a college classroom, but I think it sometimes does happen in the individual lives of college students. I mean, they've told me this. So again, it's like going back to our earlier conversation. I don't think you can predict what's going to happen. I don't think you can make people have this experience. They either have it or they don't.